everybody. I am talking today about building an inclusive library space. And Trevor is going to share the link in the chat. And then there's also, if I skip ahead here, a bit.ly in the corner of this slide. And it's also linked to the Schedule. So I am a middle school teacher librarian. I know some people do not enjoy middle schoolers. I love them. I think they're amazing and quirky and hilarious and keep me on my toes. So I work with 5th through 8th graders at Hamilton Southeastern Intermediate Junior High, which is a bit of a mouthful for a school name, in Central Indiana. So I'm a Hoosier, and this is my first ever CSLA. So I'm really excited to be here and join all of you. I'm also an equity coach in my building. There are 2 of us in my building, and we lead our building equity team. And then we also are part of a group of coaches across the district that work to try to move things forward. I'm also the GSA sponsor, and I'm very active on Twitter. So if there's any questions like we don't get to or anything like that today, or if you're viewing this after the fact, since these are all recorded, for sure just reach out. And all of these are linked to like my personal social media or my school. Oh, and I meant to turn on closed captions at the beginning. There we go. Now I have it. Sorry about that. Okay, so what does inclusive mean to you? So if you would just take a moment and just, put maybe some words or phrases that pop into your head first in the chat about what does inclusive mean to you. And then we'll talk about what some things I've thought about with it and some examples about things I've been trying to do in my library. See, Heather talked about accessibility. Accessibility is definitely a big one. I've had some conversations with librarians about the fact that libraries and librarians can be gatekeepers, and sometimes people get mad when I say that. But it's true, right? We can either provide access or block people from getting access. Obviously, hopefully not intentionally, but we need to make sure that we're keeping those lines of access open and helping, our ENL students, helping our students who are hard of hearing, helping students who are in a wheelchair, just different obstacles and different types of access. Some of those that I just named, I thought of those because those are some students that I've worked with in my building and in my experiences. Everyone being included and feeling welcome and safe, different groups being represented, everyone welcome. Yes, awesome. So definitely seeing some common threads there in the chat. Now, given I had a little bit more time to think about this, right, than all of you, so mine's a little bit longer, but inclusive library to me, all races, religions, gender identities, sexual orientations, and abilities are represented, respected, and intentionally included in visible ways. The library is a safe place for all. Hate speech is not tolerated. Resources are accessible, and the librarian is an advocate. So one thing I try to be mindful of is when I'm trying to include everybody or trying to represent everyone, who or what isn't included, right? Is there any group that I'm leaving out or a group that isn't as represented in our collection? And I know sometimes, having gaps in our collection, sometimes we need publishers or people to provide more resources, but those are things that we can still try to purchase and advocate for. And I know being in the area I'm in Indiana, I have seen some books get challenged, especially at the elementary level, related to LGBTQ issues. And we need to, include those books at different age levels and advocate for those being included in our library, hopefully. So that way, again, we're making it a safe place for everyone, and not leaving any groups out or making any groups othered or controversial or anything like that. All right, so the first thing that I started with and that I encourage other people to start with is self-work, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is about working on yourself and starting to unpack some of your own biases, some of your past learning, some things that maybe you learned in school, and then you find out later, oh, that is not the full side of that story historically, right? And just working to learn more of those things. And then also with the amount of white educators and white librarians that still dominate those fields, we also need to do our part to unpack our white privilege that we all carry, and what that means in the spaces we go into or in our libraries. So diversity, equity, and inclusion work must start within. And also, if we don't start with ourselves, we could do more harm than good. A lot of times people have really good intentions, but then the impact ends up being harmful. And that's something that gets brought up a lot with different equity trainings I've been to, that, impact matters more than intent. So just because we had good intentions, that doesn't make it okay if we have a negative impact and we just, offended this group that we were trying to reach out for or advocate for. So it's something we always need to be mindful of. And every person has biases. So it's just important to be aware of that and work on unpacking that. So to start with self-learning and self-work, these are places that have helped me. So, different things might work for different people, but I wanted to share some resources and things that have benefited me and my self-work and learning, which is an ongoing process, right? It's not like I, magically know everything there is to know about equity work after doing it for, a handful of years. It's an ongoing process. There's not like a finish line. So trainings are definitely helpful. Learning for justice, if you've maybe heard of teaching tolerance. Teaching tolerance and learning for justice are the same. They just very, very recently, like I think within the past week or so, changed their name. So they're now learning for justice. But they always have very timely resources. If you sign up for their newsletter, like anytime any sort of event happens publicly that involves anything with rights or equality or anything like that, they're always sharing resources about that. Twitter, as I mentioned, I'm very active on Twitter, and I've learned from so many wonderful people on there. That links, some of these are linked, as you can see. I hope that one is linked to some of the equity people, especially that I have learned from. It's not all of them, but it's some of them. Reading BIPOC Voices, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So reading from different perspectives, reading from different voices, both fiction and nonfiction, can really be instrumental in this work and in changing our perspectives and helping us be more empathetic or more aware.
Joanne?
Sorry.
There's a question in there about, could you go over a little bit more about the Disrupt texts?
Yeah, so Disrupt Text was started by 4 females who are involved in different capacities with education. There's Dr. Kim Parker, Trisha Abarvia, Lorena Herman, and Julia Torres. And they're all 4 phenomenal. And they came together to work with Disrupt Text. And what that's about is trying to think about what we're teaching in the classroom and mixing it up with some more modern text. So for example, when they talk about a text that has been called a classic for a long time, such as, To Kill a Mockingbird, they're not advocating, some groups accuse them of censorship. They're not advocating for censorship or removal of books, but they are advocating for teaching those books through a different lens, or pairing that book with some modern books or texts or essays or what have you from a different perspective, or looking at some of the criticism that To Kill a Mockingbird has had in modern years. And so just looking at that more critically and pairing those texts with some more modern texts that might carry a different perspective. Harvard Project Implicit is one that a former equity coach of mine recommended. It has all sorts of quizzes They're not like super fancy or pretty to look at, but they are effective about, what groups do we have biases against or for? Like, do we lean towards males or females, or one race or another race, or, different things like that. And it has some quizzes that go kind of on instinct and can reveal some biases. And then Project Ready is a basically curriculum that's free online for librarians, about working on equity work and working to advocate for all students and understand our history, and all of those types of things. And of course, there's some great podcasts out there. I linked two that I've been a big fan of listening to recently, about equity topics. And again, these are just some of the many resources out there, but these are some of the ones that have impacted my learning heavily. And so too, when we're doing this work, we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and lean into that discomfort, because that's where the growth happens. And, being an equity coach in my building, a lot of times when we're trying to work with some of our other staff members who are a little more hesitant, this is where they really struggle is, when we feel uncomfortable, we just want to not deal with that and we just want to walk away from it. But that is where the growth happens. And so if we recognize that something is making us uncomfortable or something is making us feel defensive, it's really important that we try to sit with that and unpack why. Why is that making me uncomfortable? Why do I feel defensive? Should I feel defensive? And just kind of looking at that from an objective angle, which can be really hard in the moment, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. I mean, not that it's ever easy, but it becomes more natural and more instinctive as you go through that. And another thing that I've seen stop some people from this work is the fear of making a mistake. So just accept that at some point you're going to make a mistake. At some point you're going to mean well, stick your foot in your mouth, have something you said be understood differently by different groups of people, and just accept that. And then when that happens, apologize, accept responsibility, and tell that person or group how you're going to do better. So it's really important that even if that's not what we meant, that we take responsibility for it and that we let them know what steps we're going to take to try to prevent that from happening again. All right, so visible representation. Okay, so that was a lot about self-work, but self-work is super important. So now we're going to switch to more of a library focus, right? So visible representation in the library. Every kid, I mean, this year is maybe a little different. I know my school is 75% open right now. We're like half hybrid and half full-time, but I know some folks are, fully hybrid, fully virtual, fully in person. We all got different things going on. But every student encounters our space, whether it's a physical space, a virtual space, Canvas, in person, depending on your situation. Every kid encounters our space. So visibility, we have great opportunities to show kids that we see them and to show kids that we represent and advocate for everyone. And so over the past few years, and this has been a work in progress, I've been working on becoming more and more intentional with my displays, and thinking about, okay, what groups do I have represented? What groups do I not? And really trying to include everyone, every type of identity, every type of culture, different ability levels, and try to include all of those in my displays as much as possible. And then two, I started trying to be more intentional about reading diverse books. Now, I've always read a pretty wide variety of diverse books, but one thing I realized when I was doing a project to intentionally add more middle school LGBTQ fiction to my library was reading more of those books. And I had read some before, but it wasn't necessarily something I'd sought out. And so that was big for me, especially now that since then I've become a GSA sponsor. That's really added to my understanding, added to perspectives, added to my empathy and conversations I have with these kids. So it's really important to be intentional ourselves about reading it. And then two, other kids see we're reading it, right? So that middle picture are books that are on the side of my desk that I post up throughout the year. And then some students have like Twitter or Instagram. And so I also try to post things there about, different books that I'm reading. Another first step, so these were some of my earlier steps. I added pronouns to my email, and they have since been added to other places as well. That was just, I think, the first place I added them. So my pronouns are she, her, hers. And then also there is a picture of a display one of my teachers made. And so even though I didn't, make that or take credit for it, I wanted to promote what they were doing. And I wanted to, show other people what some of our teachers were doing and, give them some encouragement and show other staff some things that were going on in our building. And then just keep going, right? Just continue to build each year. So originally my focus was very much on having inclusive displays. And then last year I had a conversation with somebody that involved a student where their teachers that they had didn't specifically do anything in regards to Black History Month. And that kid felt not seen and not represented. And so that really made me think. And so last year I started taking more of a yes and approach. Like, yes, do the inclusive displays all year, but also I can do pull-out displays for American Indian Heritage Month and Hispanic Heritage Month and Black History Month and Disabilities Awareness Month. Like, I can take a yes and approach, but also remind people that those books are in our library all year long. So that's what the pictures on the left are of some of those pull-out displays last year. This year, of course, has thrown some curveballs at us. But I've been working on moving those lists that I had created in Destiny, but only so I could see them, and moving those over to public Destiny collections. So that way I can still show kids, these books and these authors and different things that we have, even if I don't have the physical display out. And then we added a land acknowledgement last year, giving attribution to the tribes that were the guardians of the land in my part of Indiana that my school is in, and added my pronouns, like a little name plaque that goes on the side of my desk that I made in Canva. But I will also say that with the land acknowledgement and with the pronouns, it's important that sometimes when we hear about those things, we just want to dive right into them. And I was guilty of that too with the land acknowledgement. I was like, oh my gosh, I need to do that. That's so cool. I'm going to do that. We have a lot of 5th grade teachers that talk about Native Americans. Like, what a great conversation to talk about, like, who was in this area and what a land acknowledgement is. But I had to stop myself for a minute. Like, whoa, Joy, are you for sure you are 100% that these tribes are accurate? And do you understand the full story of why people do land acknowledgements? So I made myself slow down. I had done my research about tribes and was pretty confident, but then I reached out to a local historical site who does a lot of work with our schools, Conner Prairie, and I checked with them, do I have this information correct? And then, I also read the information from the NMAI organization and arts and culture group with the government, and read their materials on land acknowledgements, made sure I understood. Same thing with pronouns. Yes, it is great for your students with different gender identities who might consider themselves, transgender or non-binary or a number of other gender identities. It is great for them to see representation with your pronouns. And I've had several students comment on that. And to be honest, the students who don't understand the pronoun thing, like they just like, they don't even pay attention to that or look at that, right? But the students who get it and appreciate it. But again, with pronouns, understand why that is important to the LGBTQ community before we just like put them out there. So again, it's part of that learning as we work through this work. And then just increasing my intentionality. I'm just constantly trying to become more intentional with this work. So at the beginning of the year, we started virtually, even though we're back now, and we've gone back and forth a few times. But like to the left there, I did a genre activity with some 5th and 6th graders over Zoom, and that involved some book talks and ebooks and stuff. And so I was very intentional about what ebooks I purchased. I was also very intentional about which ones I included when we were looking at different genres, and really trying to have a wide variety of representation, and just having that be kind of a normal part of what our library promotes and advocates for, right? We don't necessarily make it like a huge deal each time, like, hey, I'm going to talk about diverse books, right? Like I just talk about the books and they are diverse. And so we're just normalizing that and having that be a part of our culture and a part of what we do on a regular basis. Action. So taking action, this kind of goes with the advocacy piece and advocating for all of our students. Sometimes it's public and sometimes it is behind the scenes. And so some visible allyship. So one of the things that was really important to the members of my GSA last year was just increasing their visibility in the school. So, those were some signs we made on the left about Ally Week. We also did some things for other weeks and other months. We sometimes put up posters, sometimes had announcements that the principal or student announcements would read, and just trying to increase that visibility and make sure that people, were aware that, we have LGBTQ plus students in our school, because tragically, sometimes at the middle school level, at least where I'm at, they feel like they're the only ones. And that's a shame, and they shouldn't have to feel that way. And that's definitely not the truth. And then, there's different things like Pronoun Day and Blackout Tuesday. And I will mention though, that while it is great to support, Blackout Tuesday and post, a Black background or Black Lives Matter, things like that, we just need to be careful of making sure that our actions follow that up. I've heard a lot of equity people warn people this year about performative allyship, where we, retweet something or we like something or we post a Black square, but that's where it stops. And so we need to make sure that it extends beyond that. Like when we're looking at our collection, when we're supporting our students, when we're having conversations with people. And truthfully, sometimes it's the toughest to have equity conversations with family members or colleagues more than strangers. But it's important that we have more and more of these conversations with people to keep that forward progress going. Critically evaluate our collection in our libraries and in our classroom libraries, because a lot of our teachers might have libraries as well in their classrooms. So both of these resources are linked. So the one on the left, How Inclusive is Your Literacy Classroom Really, is by one of the Disrupt Text co-founders who we mentioned earlier. This one's by Trisha Abarvia. It's a PDF that came with an article she wrote about how inclusive is your literacy classroom really, and she breaks it down into 8 questions and then some different sub questions within that. And then Leon Lowe Books, who's also come out with some really strong book lists that promote diversity. They have a classroom library questionnaire where they ask different things about, do we have books about this? Do we have books about that? Do we represent these groups? And just kind of a checklist. So one, these could be good to share with our colleagues who have classroom libraries, but two, I think that these both have really powerful questions that we can still apply to our libraries, that we just obviously have a bigger range than a classroom library does. I've had some colleagues do like random polls, of pulling like a certain shelf and seeing what's there, like just picking a random shelf, who's here, who's not. There's people who are doing diversity audits. I have not had a chance to do a full-scale diversity audit yet, but it's definitely something I'm interested in. But one thing too about like those months that I started doing more with last year for, Arab American Heritage Month and Hispanic Heritage Month and different things, it really helped me see which groups are strongly represented and which groups could use some collection development work and need to be strengthened because there's not enough in my collection. So that was really powerful for me to see that and see some gaps that I might not have been aware of otherwise. Also with collection development, just thinking about who are we getting our recommendations from? If we're only getting our recommendations from, one type of reader or one magazine or one what have you, then we're not going to see the full spectrum of what's out there. Seeking diversity within your diversity. I think that now we're at a point where a lot of libraries likely have a diverse realistic fiction section, for example. But what about their fantasy section? What about their graphic novel section, right? Do those genres in their library feature people with different gender identities or different skin tones or different ability levels, right? And so being intentional that not all of our diverse books and books that feature different identities are falling within the same genre. Are they own voices? Are they well reviewed? If you're not familiar with own voices, it is about, and I'm blanking right now on the woman who started that term, I apologize. But it is a hashtag and term that started to promote books that reflect the identities of the author. Okay, so for example, I read an arc of a children's book this summer through NetGalley, and it had a Black child on the front cover, and it was a full series. So I'm like, oh, okay, this author is probably Black. And then I look it up, and no, it is a white woman in Europe somewhere who has written this series. And there have been many a debate about this in the library and publishing world, but I definitely do fall in the camp that you can't accurately portray a culture that you are not a part of. You haven't lived those experiences, you haven't grown up with that, it's going to be more one-dimensional, which could then, not accurately portray their culture or could come off as stereotypical. Plus, we know that the publishing world is also still heavily white, and we should be continuing to seek out authors of different identities to speak to their cultures and to speak to their experiences. So it's definitely something to think about, right? And if I know that one of the areas in my collection that needs development, for example, is one by Arab American authors, then, if I'm purchasing own voice, if I'm not purchasing own voices and purchasing stories about those experiences from a white perspective, I'm not helping shift that needle. So I know that there's been a lot of debate about that, and you might not agree with me on that one. So take that take that for what you will. We Need Diverse Books has a lot of book lists. I linked, this image is linked here about where to find diverse books. They have, oh yes, that's right. I just saw, sorry, I just checked the chat. Emily gave the name Corinne, who started Own Voices. Yes, that is correct. Thank you so much. I blanked on that. So where to find diverse books? They have a lot of resources there, including the award winners that come from different categories. Like there's the AILA award that is awarded to books by American Indians each year. There's the Stonewall for LGBTQ. There's the Coretta Scott King that deals with Black authors and illustrators, right? There's all these great award lists about different groups and representation. So definitely keep an eye on those each year. If that's not something you're used to doing, I would encourage you to do that. And then too, I noticed that when I did work, I mentioned that project I worked on with LGBTQ collection development, I had to be really intentional about looking for middle grade book lists. There, especially for my 5th and 6th graders, there were not as many resources as I thought there would be to help me find ones that were well reviewed and weren't seen as, you know, offensive or stereotypical, because, you know, of course, reviews matter when you're looking at diversifying your collection. We don't want something that, you know, is offending people or anything like that in, you know, a way that is harmful to their culture. So that kind of, this is linked to Wakelet, and that, oops, I just clicked on it. And that shows some different steps that I took to try to work on that. And then this is a picture of my classics section. So my library is genreified, and we had a classic section when I inherited it. And, you know, somebody asked me, or well, not asked me, but asked the audience during a presentation last year, you know, what message does the classic section send if we have that? And that really stuck with me. And so, you know, I'm not here to say get rid of all of your classics, and I'm not saying I got rid of all of them. I didn't. But what I did this fall, I took a hard look at my classics section. And also, if you are a big supporter of having a classic section, I will also say that middle schoolers don't go there unless a teacher makes them. I have never seen a middle schooler go to the classic section by choice in my building. They only go there if like a teacher makes them. So for those classics that do still circulate, it will help them if they're in a different area, right? So what I did was I tried to look objectively at these books that were in the classic section. You know, do they still circulate in this library? When was the last time they were checked out? You know, looking at them how I would any other book that has been in the library for a long time and is being considered for possible weeding. And then so some of them did leave because they hadn't circulated in like 7 years, but some of them stayed. And so then I just moved them to their other area. So like Alice in Wonderland was one that stayed, that moved to our fantasy sci-fi section. So it's not gone, it's just not in the classic section anymore. Recommending resources is another great way that librarians can influence our colleagues and our curriculum, and as an extension, then our students. And so I gathered some election resources this fall for my 6th grade teachers. Also, I mentioned that my 5th grade teachers do a lot of work with American Indians and looking at different tribes and history. The new textbook that was adopted maybe 2 years ago has a few issues with how some things with Columbus and different things are represented. So it's really important that those teachers have access to strong Native American resources and resources from different perspectives and up-to-date information on tribes that are still here and thriving, and different things that are happening in those communities. And so that's something I've been intentional about. So, that's another way that we can influence our staff and advocate for students and other groups and try to counter textbooks that can be harmful at times, because sometimes they only show one side of the story. And so that's something that we can help with, is showing multiple sides of a story. Actionable allyship example. So I will be a little bit careful with what I say here, but my school district was recently in the news for some things that came out related to Black Lives Matter and whether or not teachers could talk about it. And so there were a lot of emotions and opinions on that. And so a lot of teachers and librarians across the district, including myself, decided to respond to that with some visible and behind the scenes steps. So some visible steps, I mentioned moving my Destiny cultural lists over for like the different months that I mentioned. And I know I didn't mention all of them. And maybe, I think I saw somebody too ask when one of the months was, so I will, maybe I can share that later on Twitter, because I don't think I have that linked there, but I have a document that shows me what months are when, to help me keep track of that. But so, I finished moving those lists over. I made a display. I thought this poster was really cool. It's linked. It's from Harper Stacks. I did not make that. I want to give them credit for that. About Black Voices Matter, and, just doing different things to try to send a message to our students. We see you and we support you, and we support this movement. But then there was also a lot of things behind the scenes when some of these words and news articles and things came out. There's a lot of conversations that happened, especially amongst equity coaches, but I'm sure also amongst community members and teachers and students and other places as well. But the equity coaches is what I can speak to, and the librarians. We were doing a lot of brainstorming. We were opening lines of communication. We were writing letters to voice concerns and opinions. We were signing each other's letters. We were advocating as much as we could publicly on social media. There are lines that I know to not cross, but I will definitely stick my toe up to that line on Twitter with advocating for some things. And so I did. Having, again, those conversations with folks that aren't always easy, but can push the work forward, and, making sure and finding the correct information and sharing that, right? Since that is, of course, one of our tenets and roles as school librarians, to make sure people have the correct information or try to help them find that accurate information. So what's next? So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in a minute, but it's okay to start small, but you can't stay small. You have to keep pushing and growing, so some librarians, that their first step might be, making a book list, making a display, putting out a poster about everybody being welcome, right? And those are great first steps. I am not in any way dismissing that. Those are great first steps to take. But we just need to make sure it doesn't stop there, right? And we need to continue to push and continue to grow and continue to find new ways of incorporating these ideas of inclusivity each year.
Just interrupt.
So some of, go ahead.
The 10-minute.
Okay.
We're good on questions and everything. Just you said the 10-minute warning.
Perfect. And I am almost ready for questions. So we are almost there. I'm almost done talking, I promise. So some of my next steps that I've been thinking about. So the GSA, we have been meeting recently via Zoom, but it's just different, and it's uncomfortable for some of them. So I'm still trying to figure out the best way to make that work in a digital space. You know, I'm still working on weeding. We've been doing a big weeding project this year, and filling gaps, and you know, some of those things I'll just always be working on. I was really hoping to start a student advisory board this year, but then with the pandemic and schedule changes, that went out the window. So maybe next year. And then I have this idea of having an author area that just shows a lot of different authors, and a lot of different people, and just wanting kids to see themselves and wanting them to see that, you know, there are writers who look like them or identify in some way like them. But I have not had time this year, unfortunately, to think about the best way to execute that idea. So I gotta figure that out, but you know, one day. So two things. One, or actually you could say this out loud or in the chat, either one. I would love it if some people shared, you know, like what's next for you? Like what is something that you're currently working on or that you would like to work on? And you could say it out loud or you could share it in the chat. And then also, I am open for any questions right now. So questions, what's next for you? I will take either or both. Oh, cool. Sandra said that she has a Read Woke book club online. I know Cicely Lewis has done a lot with that and started like the Read Woke movement. She's another really good person to follow on Twitter. If you have not heard of Cicely or do not follow her, she does some awesome stuff with her students. Yeah, Sophia mentioned weeding out the classic books. And two, I'm not gonna lie, I had a couple people panic and be like, whoa, you're getting rid of all of the classics, you know? And I'm like, no. I'm gonna keep the ones that circulate. They're just not gonna be in the classics section anymore. They're gonna be somewhere else. And the ones that don't circulate, I should treat like any other book that doesn't circulate. So that was the stance I took on that. But yes, and two, I mean, you know, there's a lot of, you know, Disrupt Text and a lot of other people also have some thoughts about, you know, who decided those books were a classic and how did that get determined? And that's really difficult for a lot of people to have that conversation because a lot of us become attached to certain books or certain authors or certain things we've always taught or always recommended. And so again, that kind of goes back to the fact that this work can be uncomfortable as you continue through it. Okay, a couple people are talking about working with the English department on rethinking the class novels. Yes, that, I mean, you know, I'm sure a lot of us have learned there's times we can like barge into those conversations and there's times we kind of have to like tiptoe into them with different departments or different decisions. But you know, just a year or so ago, one of my English departments was looking at having like a lit circle option instead of a whole class option, which is what they typically do at that grade level. And I was really excited when they had me be a part of that meeting and that I could share some ideas of some books to go with those lit circles, and you know, came from different authors with different backgrounds and wasn't the same thing they had always taught, and just looking at some different ideas. Heather talked about working on an inclusive collection challenge policy. Yes, challenges, it's really important to be aware of that. I'm actually working on, I say working on, I haven't started. I'm hoping to start this weekend, but getting ready to work on revamping my challenge policy, because it's really, I have not had a challenge yet, which I'm almost surprised about just because I push the line a little bit sometimes, but I haven't had one yet. but I know I probably will at some point. But I did mention, some elementary librarians I know have had some locally, especially in regards to LGBTQ books, unfortunately. So it's really important that that is definitely something we are prepared for. Yeah, Emily talks about thinking about what students will be attached to in the future, and books that made them be a reader. It's, not necessarily going to be the same books that made us a reader, right? Oh, okay, cool. Anne talked about adding books with 10 plus copies has been helpful for getting people to use lit circles. It's a budget commitment. Yes, for sure. I feel that. Because my building used to only be 7-8. And the year I started, which was 6 years ago now at that building, I've been in education for 11 years, but in my school library enrolled for 6 years. And they just started having 5th and 6th graders in that building. And the other 5-6 buildings in the district have tons of class sets and lit circle books, and I have a small amount. So I feel that investment pain, because I've been trying to build those up, but it has been gradual. It takes some time. Oh, cool. Brandy's talking about a monthly book club around diverse titles, reflective conversations for Saturday in March, and encouraging others to join the committee. Yeah, it sounds like she has a committee for leadership for diversity. So yes, CSLA people, I encourage you to look into that and connect with Brandy. That sounds amazing. And two, if anybody thinks of questions later, again, I am probably too active on Twitter, but I will see it if you reach out to me on Twitter. So if you think of a question later, or if there was a resource I mentioned that I didn't link on the slides, or anything like that, for sure, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to follow up on that. And two, I know we have a couple minutes left here. If anybody else wants to ask a question or share what might be the next step for them, but while I'm waiting a minute to see on that, just thank you for stopping by this session today. Thanks for spending part of your Saturday with me. And this work is something that I have become increasingly passionate about, and has really been fulfilling. Teaching is fulfilling, but so is trying to make a better future for our families and our students and different people. Yes, and said something about Hispanic, Latino YA books not centered on immigration, more like Latino joy. Yes, I have seen that conversation get brought up too a lot about more books about Black joy instead of like Black tragedy or oppression. Jewish books not centered on the Holocaust. Yes, again, I think that goes back to having diversity within your diversity, right? If you only have books that represent that group of people that are about the same topic, or that are sad or oppressive or overcoming obstacles, like what message is that telling to our kids? And don't get me wrong, like we need to have those books, but we also need to have books that are the opposite, and books that are about them just living or just being kids or going on an adventure, or like Brandy said, stories that show everyday life for everyone. So it's really, and that was something too that we reminded our staff of as we got ready to enter Black History Month this month. Yes, talking about civil rights and different people that overcame obstacles is great, but also let's talk about Black successes and inventors and joy and different things. And it's really important to make sure we're not just showing the pain that a group has experienced.
Okay, it's time. We're going to have to be shutting it down pretty soon. But
okay.
want to encourage everybody, like you said, reach out on Twitter, and we have very active Discord with all of questions and people answering other people's questions. It's amazing. So there's that opportunity as well. Thank you very much for some challenging ideas. Got me thinking about, although I'm sure everybody else is feeling the same way. Really appreciate your time and people that came and spent their time with us too as well. But need to move on to the next session. Thank you. Have a good time.
Yes, thank you. You too.
Bye bye, guys.